Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my good friend Tios for what I believe is part 3 in our ongoing series on the apostles of Jesus Christ. And we are today going to discuss 2 of the apostles known as the Sons of Thunder, the Zebedee brothers. And before we get started, just make sure you join us on the Temple Mount Discord server and check out our podcast, the Temple Mount Official Podcast, on YouTube and BitChute. That being said, welcome, Tios. Thank you for joining me. How are you, sir?
Thank you for having me, Shogun. It's good to be back. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you. It's been a good day. Looking forward to a nice weekend up ahead and looking forward to this conversation. I have a lot to learn about the apostles, and I'm particularly interested in this pair, the Sons of Thunder. And as we've mentioned before, a lot of this is drawing on the Urantia book, which is an interesting subject in itself. We've done a podcast on the Urantia book in and of itself. But where do you think is the best place to start with James and John Zebedee?
Right. Well, I think starting right where we left off, we went through last time. We read about Andrew and Simon Peter, the first 2 apostles, and this time we're going to start with the 3rd apostle. So you were right, half right. This will be our 2nd episode, but we're starting with the 3rd apostle, James Zebedee, and then with his brother John Zebedee. And I was just looking over some of the reading that I'd be doing tonight, and just wanted to I think reiterate for everybody why I think it's so important. This particular reading is the insight into the human psyche of each individual apostle that is given in the Urantia book. I don't think is available anywhere else. This kind of I think psychological breakdown of their character, I think makes them into such a relatable and rememberable experience that you'll never forget listening to it or once you've read it. So if you're ready here, Shogun, I'll begin with James Zebedee.
Perfect. Take us into it. Thank you.
James, the older of the 2 apostles, sons of Zebedee, who Jesus nicknamed the Sons of Thunder, was 30 years old when he became an apostle. He was married, had 4 children, and lived near his parents in the outskirts of Capernaum, Bethsaida. He was a fisherman, plying his calling in company with his younger brother John, and in association with Andrew and Simon. James and his brother John enjoyed the advantage of having known Jesus longer than any of the other apostles. This able apostle was a temperamental contradiction. He seemed really to possess 2 natures, both of which were actuated by strong feelings. He was particularly vehement when his indignation was once fully aroused. He had a fiery temper when once it was adequately provoked. But when the storm was over, he was always wont to justify and excuse his anger under the pretense that it was wholly a manifestation of righteous indignation. Except for these periodic upheavals of wrath, James's personality was much like that of Andrew. He did not have Andrew's discretion or insight into human nature, but he was a much better public speaker. Next to Peter, unless it was Matthew, James was the best public orator among the 12. And though James was in no sense moody, he could be quiet and taciturn one day, and a very good talker and storyteller the next. He usually talked freely with Jesus, but among the 12, for days at a time, he was the silent man. His one great weakness was these spells of unaccountable silence. The outstanding feature of James's personality was his ability to see all sides of a proposition. Of all the 12, he came the nearest to grasping the real importance and significance of Jesus' teaching. He, too, was slow at first to comprehend the Master's meaning, but ere they had finished their training, he had acquired a superior concept of Jesus' message. James was able to understand a wide range of human nature, and he got along well with the versatile Andrew and the impetuous Peter. and his self-contained brother John. And though James and John had their troubles trying to work together, it was inspiring to observe how well they got along. They did not succeed quite so well as Andrew and Peter, but they had a much better than would an ordinarily expected of two brothers, especially such headstrong and determined brothers. But strange as it may seem, these two sons of Zebedee were much more tolerant of each other than they were of strangers. They had a great affection for one another, and they had always been happy playmates. It was these sons of thunder who wanted to call down fire from heaven to destroy the Samaritans who presumed to show disrespect for their master. But the untimely death of James greatly modified the vehement temperament of his younger brother John. That characteristic of Jesus which James most admired was the master's sympathetic affection. Jesus' understanding interest in the small and the great, the rich and the poor, made a great appeal to him. James Zebedee was a well-balanced thinker and planner. Along with Andrew, he was one of the more level-headed of the apostolic group. He was a vigorous individual, but never in a hurry. He was an excellent balance built for Peter. He was modest and undramatic, a daily server, and an unpretentious worker, seeking no special reward once he grasped something of the real meaning of the kingdom. And even in the story about the mother of James and John, who asked that her sons be granted places on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus, it should be remembered that it was the mother who made this request. And when they signified that they were ready to assume such responsibilities, it should be recognized that they were cognizant of the dangers accompanying the master's supposed revolt against the Roman power, and that they were also willing to pay that price. When Jesus asked if they were ready to drink the cup, they replied that they were. And as it concerns James, it was literally true. He did not drink the cup with the master, seeing that he was the first of the apostles to experience martyrdom. Being early put to death with the sword by Herod Agrippa, James was thus the first of the 12 to sacrifice his life upon the new battle line of the kingdom. Herod Agrippa feared James above all of the other apostles. He was indeed often quiet and silent, but he was brave and determined when his convictions were aroused and challenged. James lived his life to the full, and when the end came, he bore himself with such grace and fortitude that even his accuser and informer, who had attended his trial and execution, was so touched that he rushed away from the scene of James's death to join himself to the disciples of Jesus. So I'll pause there for James Zebedee and maybe see if anybody that's listening or showing yourself, if you want to talk about James Zebedee before we move on to John, maybe something about his characteristics that's touched anyone, or maybe you relate to. If anybody has anything they want to say before I move on.
Maybe you covered this already, or maybe it was obvious from the narrative, but was there any difference in time when the two brothers encountered Jesus, or were they together the first time they met Jesus? And I'm sorry if that was covered, but
I don't believe it was covered, but I do believe that they met Jesus at the same time. Yeah. And I hopefully we'll get an answer to that question in the reading of his brother. Now I'm interested to find that out as well. And it may actually be covered in the rest of the book, which is quite lengthy about their relationship with each other. It kind of goes day by day, so imagine it would.
all right. Unless anyone else has a question, maybe we should get the profile of both characters, and then we'll get into some more.
So John Zebedee. When he became an apostle, John was 24 years old and was the youngest of the 12. He was unmarried and lived with his parents at Bethsaida. He was a fisherman and worked with his brother James in partnership with Andrew and Peter. Both before and after becoming an apostle, John functioned as the personal agent of Jesus in dealing with the Master's family, and he continued to bear this responsibility as long as Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived. Since John was the youngest of the 12 and so closely associated with Jesus and his family affairs, he was very dear to the Master. But it cannot be truthfully said that he was, quote, the disciple whom Jesus loved, unquote. You would hardly suspect such a magnanimous personality as Jesus to be guilty of showing favoritism, of loving one of his apostles more than the others. The fact that John was one of the three personal aides of Jesus lent further color to this mistaken idea. Not to mention that John, along with his brother James, had known Jesus longer than the others. Peter, James, and John were assigned as personal aides to Jesus soon after they became apostles. Shortly after the selection of the 12, and at the time Jesus appointed Andrew to act as director of the group, he said to them, "And now I desire that you assign 2 or 3 of your associates to be with me and to remain by my side, to comfort me and to minister to my daily needs." And Andrew thought best to select for this special duty the next 3 first chosen apostles. He would have liked to volunteer for such a blessed service himself, but the Master had already given him his commission, so he immediately directed that Peter, James, and John attach themselves to Jesus. John Zebedee had many lovely traits of character, but one which was not so lovely was his inordinate but usually well concealed conceit. His long association with Jesus made many and great changes in his character. This conceit was greatly lessened, but after growing old and becoming more or less childish. This self-esteem reappeared to a certain extent, so that when he engaged in directing Nathan and writing of the Gospels, which now bears his name, the aged apostle did not hesitate repeatedly to refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. In view of that fact that John came nearer to becoming the chum of Jesus than any other mortal, that he was so chosen personal representative in so many matters, it is not strange that he should have come to regard himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, since he most certainly knew he was the disciple whom Jesus so frequently trusted. The strongest trait in John's character was his dependability. He was prompt and courageous, faithful and devoted. His greatest weakness was this characteristic conceit. He was the youngest member of his father's family and the youngest of the apostolic group. Perhaps he was just a bit spoiled. Maybe he had been humored slightly too much. But the John of after years was a very different type of person than the self-admiring and arbitrary young man who joined the ranks of Jesus' apostles when he was 24. Those characteristics of Jesus which John most appreciated were the Master's love and unselfishness. These traits made such an impression on him that his whole subsequent life became dominated by the sentiment of love and brotherly devotion. He talked about love and wrote about love. This son of thunder became the apostle of love. And in Ephesus, when the aged bishop was no longer able to stand in the pulpit and preach, but had to be carried to church in a chair, and with the close of the service, he was asked to say a few words to the believers. For years, his only utterance was, "My children, love one another. My little children, love one another." John was a man of few words, except when his temper was aroused. He thought much, but said little. As he grew older, his temper became more subdued, but better controlled. He never overcame his disinclination to talk, and he never fully mastered this reticence, but he was gifted with a remarkable and creative imagination. There was another side to John that one would not expect to find in this quiet and introspective type. He was somewhat bigoted and unordinarily intolerant. In this respect, he and James were much alike. They both wanted to call down fire from heaven on the heads of the disrespectful Samaritans. When John encountered some stranger teaching in Jesus' name, he promptly forbade them. But it was not the only one of the 12 who was tainted with this kind of self-esteem and superiority consciousness. John's life was tremendously influenced by the sight of Jesus going about without a home, as he knew how faithfully he had made provisions for the care of his mother and family. John also deeply sympathized with Jesus because of his family's failure to understand him, being aware that they were gradually withdrawing from him. This entire situation, together with Jesus ever deferring his slightest wish to the will of the Father in heaven and his daily life of implicit trust, made such a profound impression on John that it produced marked and permanent changes in his character, changes which manifested themselves throughout his entire subsequent life. John had a cool and daring courage, which few of the other apostles possessed. He was one apostle who followed right along with Jesus the night of his arrest and dared to accompany his master into the very jaws of death. He was present and near and at hand right up to the last earthly hour and was found faithfully carrying out his trust with regard to Jesus' mother and ready to receive such additional instructions as might be given during the last moments of the master's mortal existence. One thing is certain: John was thoroughly dependable. John usually sat on Jesus' right hand when the 12 were at meat. He was the first of the 12, really, and fully to believe in the resurrection. And he was the first to recognize the Master when he came to them on the seashore after his resurrection. This son of Zebedee was very closely associated with Peter in the early activities of the Christian movement, becoming one of the chief supporters of the Jerusalem church. He was the right-hand support of Peter on the day of Pentecost. And several years after the martyrdom of James, John married his brother's widow. The last 20 years of his life he was cared for by a loving granddaughter. John was in prison several times and was banished to the Isles of Patmos for a period of 4 years until another emperor came into power in Rome. Had not John been tactful and sagacious, he would undoubtedly have been killed, as was his more outspoken brother James. As the years passed, John, together with James, the Lord's brother, learned to practice wise conciliation. And when they appeared before the civil magistrates, they found that a soft answer turns away wrath. And they also learned to represent the church as a spiritual brotherhood devoted to social service of mankind, rather than as the kingdom of heaven. They taught loving service rather than ruling power, kingdom and king. When in temporary exile in Patmos, John wrote the book of Revelation, which you now have in greatly abridged and distorted form. This book of Revelation contains the surviving fragments of a great revelation, large portions of which were lost, and other portions of which were removed. Subsequent to John's writing, it is preserved in only fragmentary and adulterated form. John traveled much, labored incessantly, and after becoming bishop of the Asia churches, settled down at the Ephesus. He directed his associate Nathan in the writing of the so-called Gospel according to John at Ephesus. And when he was 99 years old, of all the 12 apostles, John Zebedee eventually became the outstanding theologian. He died a natural death at Ephesus in AD 103 when he was 101 years of age. John Zebedee.
Wow. So a lot of detail, obviously way more intricate than anything we see in the Bible. There's very little actual airtime or fleshing out of the characters of the apostles. So that's super interesting. Now, I feel stupid asking this because I feel like the answer must have been covered, but there was a lot of information. So, can we just summarize why specifically do we think that the term Sons of Thunder was applied to these two individuals? Like, now that we've had all this breakdown of the details of their
It
ministry and
would
their personality.
it would be their fiery tempers. Would be my guess there. Uh, yeah,
So they
position.
were known as being having fiery tempers, like getting angry, getting passionate, flying off the handle,
Right.
blowing up, kind of thing.
It was described with James as being, his what his temperament would be, just this wrath, and that he would then ply out as being in a righteous indignation, right? And so imagine, yeah, these boys are sons of thunder, right? They're alive, right? It's like being around thunder when they're there. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So, what do you take the most out of this? Like, I'm wondering, what are we taking from the apostles' stories? Is the idea kind of each of them has an example that we should try and follow? Each of them has a specific lesson that kind of builds on the lessons of Christ through what they represented. Like, what do you think you take the most out of these two characters? Like, is there a lesson for us in them that we should try and follow, or what do you think?
Well, I think the thing that stands out to me is their is their humanity, right? And I think that um, once you cover the breadth of all 12 of them and get to know them as people in such a way that this book here allows us to presume that we could, right? It humanizes these people. You know, it shows their differences, not just in personality, but in the starting points of their life. James and John both had parents, right? Came from a family, right? And we'll see with some of the other apostles that's not the case. We see the effect of that on their personalities, their temperaments, their natures. And that's what I always taken away from it personally. It's just that humanizing of them. And then I think that we could all strive to aspire to their strengths and maybe reflect on the book's description of what it considers to be weaknesses, right? It described his greatest weakness to be his silence, right? His bouts of abrupt silence, right? And we're always told that the silent man and the wise one, and keep your silence. That silence is something that is just like this golden thing. Well, the book is, I think, just implying by saying it's a weakness is that sometimes you need to speak up, and that it was a weakness to not speak up.
So sometimes they would hold their silence when they should have spoken, or do you think they were falling into sort of like a melancholy silence, or like what do you think that's about?
Yeah, I think it described it really well. I'd go back to the um, exact thing. I don't know if I can find it here. His unaccountable silence. I think that's a really important, word to fully absorb when they're trying to describe this particular character trait. Unaccountable silence. What does that mean? For me, that's deep. That's, that means a lot. It means that the silence was for actually no particular reason, unaccountable, couldn't be explained, totally unnecessary, unneeded, like unaccountable. Like why? It makes me laugh, Shogun, because it's like you ask me, like, hey, you've been really quiet the past few days, you know what I mean? And I said I'm trying to answer. You're like, why was I? I was just unaccountably quiet. You're right. I'm sorry, I was unaccountable for that time. It's a great word to describe that weakness and character, and what we may have missed or been needed in those moments when we weren't speaking.
Right. Exactly. So I'm wondering where else we should go into this topic. Like, I really appreciate this. It's really interesting. This detailed sort of
Can I ask you a
breakdown.
question?
Yeah, of course.
Did you know that John was the writer of Revelation?
Yeah, I knew that
John
John was,
Zebedee.
but I did not know that that was John Zebedee. No, I've heard of John the Baptist and John the Revelator, but I was not aware that John Zebedee was the same as John the Baptist. That's very interesting. Or John the Revelator. Sorry, that's very
Right.
interesting.
And I've read this like 3 or 4 times, and if you'd asked me before, is John Zebedee the writer? I would have told you I don't know. I can't remember. You know what I mean? So it was for me too. This little insightful breakdown of them and placing them in their who they were as people. He was the one that lived to old age, right? He was the I think one of or maybe two. I think he might be the only apostle who died of natural causes, right? And so to put all those little tiny pieces together in the story really help, right? Isn't that cool?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And I mean, just on a meta conversation about the Urantia book itself. I mean, we did a podcast about that. I recommend people check it out, do their own research into the Urantia book, but totally just my opinion. But there's just something about the way that it's put together. It seems authentic. It seems believable. I have no idea what the source of this information could be, right? It's obviously supernatural in some way that the author would have all these details that are not in the Bible, but it just has a sound of authenticity to it, for whatever that means. I don't know if others agree, but um, so it's certainly cool to have that perspective, because otherwise we really have very little to go on, I guess.
Right. And I would suggest anybody who's really interested or conflicted about the source go back to our original podcast about the Rancher book, where we talk about the source of this information and why we're even sharing it and all of that. And I didn't feel like making everybody go through that kind of thing again tonight. So hopefully everybody understands. And if you do have questions about it, please go back to that first podcast we did about the Urantia book. So
Yeah, I can post a link to that in general chat as well. So I don't know, does anyone in the audience have a question or a comment for Tios or about this subject? If not, Tios, was there anything else you thought we should get into, or any other angles or aspects to this that you want to discuss?
oh, that's good, brother. I think we wrap this up and we'll keep on moving. I'm excited to continue the series with you and learn more about the apostles, because even going through it with you tonight, yeah, I think I needed to do it 3 or 4 times to connect that John Zebedee, book of the Revelation, like John Zebedee, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's huge. I didn't realize that. That's a very interesting piece of information to look into. I didn't realize that that the person who wrote Revelation was actually one of the apostles of Jesus. That's actually quite important information that really changes the way I think about Revelation. Um, so thank you so much. This is great. Shorter form content is something we need to also do. So this is great, and make sure you check out the first few podcasts on the apostles. All our other episodes you can find on the Temple Mount official podcast on YouTube and BitChute, the TMP podcast section of the Discord server. You can also find the links there. And of course, join the Temple Mount Discord server, where we do these events pretty much every day, all different subjects. So thank you so much, Tios. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your information. Looking forward to the next episode. And yeah, thanks again. All
thank
right.
you too, brother.
God bless everybody. And we will jump up to the Templar Tavern. Good night.